Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is a response to a... Whoa, is this a Christian ministry or a psycho drum section? When we see this guy, is he going to be sitting in a Mad Max apocalyptic wasteland? Nope, it's a guy sitting at his kitchen table with a bottle of Mountain Dew. Or is that Diet Mountain Dew? Nope, looks like regular, I think. I don't drink this stuff. This man's name is Jake, I don't know his last name, and he and his wife run Tamiym Ministries. Tamiym is a Hebrew word meaning without blemish. The last video I did was of course about Almando, or Christrighteous Ministries, and he was recording out of his bedroom. And the video before that was about Pastor Steve Garcia, or Star Rising Ministries Church, and Pastor Steve was recording out of the driver's seat of his car. Growing up as I did in the United Methodist Church, I always kind of believed that if you wanted to call yourself a minister or a ministry, there were certain requirements in the way of, well, infrastructure. But now I see that they really do let just anyone call themselves a ministry. Anyway, the video was entitled Atheism, Is Atheism Logical? Part 2. I watched both Part 1 and Part 2, and Part 1 was little more than a recitation of Psalm 14 and Romans 1. In other words, this big book he has open in front of him says that no, atheism is not logical. Part 2 is where evidently he gets into the arguments for why the big book in front of him is right. And that's what interests me.
All right, so this is our second part of the video I wanted to do, sort of in response to atheist arguments about them holding the market on science, and we're just religious fanatics that believe in an invisible man in the sky.
I don't believe that. Well, I mean, you do believe he's invisible, and you believe that at least one aspect of him is fully man, and to the extent that you believe that God is located in a physical direction, that direction does seem to be, up. But I understand that there's a lot more nuance to your belief than invisible man in the sky, and that it's far from the case that you're all fanatics. I suppose I wish that you weren't allowing the most fanatical and least nuanced among you have the loudest voices, but ho-hum.
I want to first of all say that if you are a well-educated scientist...
I'm probably the closest thing to a well-educated scientist that has ever watched your videos, and I'm not a scientist.
I don't suppose you have the same arguments as some of these, I would say younger people on the internet that sort of put forward these very shallow arguments against creation.
Let's be careful with terms here. Christians usually use creation to mean that which God has created, that is, to be synonymous with the universe, but they also use the word to refer to the idea that the universe was created by a God. I hope you're not suggesting that even those you call the younger people on the internet are arguing against the existence of the universe.
That don't make any sense. They haven't really thought them through. They don't really know about genetics. They've never really studied, physics or anything like that. We're going to talk about that in a second.
Are you suggesting here that you've studied physics and genetics? Or are you simply suggesting that young atheists on the internet haven't?
In terms of judging whether or not God exists based on scientific fact, first of all, we just have to look at the data.
No. Looking at the data isn't enough, even for the sake of doing science. Here, let me give you a set of data. 85, 81, 80, 72, 65. What does that data tell you? Nothing. Why? Because you have absolutely no context. You need a lot of context when you look at data in order for the data to tell you anything. But even scientific data and scientific conclusions are useless in philosophy unless they're conjoined with a philosophical premise. For example, if the God of young Earth creationism exists, then the universe is not more than 10,000 years old. The universe is more than 10,000 years old. Therefore, the God of young Earth creationism does not exist. Premise 1 comes from philosophy, or more precisely theology, and premise 2 comes from science. This is how to involve science in the God debate. You conjoin a scientific premise with a philosophical premise. You don't just look at the data. You have to actually make an argument.
All we can do is look at what we have, right? How nature works, right? If we want to say, well, nature works this way on Earth, but we're proposing that maybe out there in the universe there's some system that works completely contrary to the laws of nature. Right. I mean, you could say that. You could say that maybe there's some sort of pocket in the universe that has examples of laws of physics that completely contradict what we know to be true today, but we don't have any evidence of that. It looks like everything that we know to exist today works according to the same rules, right?
Interesting that you mentioned the assumption that the laws of nature are uniform in space, because one of the key points of creationism is that the laws of nature have not been uniform in time. Specifically, creationists tend to believe that everything sped up dramatically, probably during the year of the flood, so that, for example, we had 4.5 billion years of radioactive decay in the course of a single year. Which, of course, that much decay in such a short amount of time would release enough heat energy to vaporize the crust of the Earth. But putting that aside for now, if you're a creationist, which it'll be established later that you are, you kind of have a tough time saying that the laws of nature are uniform in space when you don't believe they're uniform in time.
Right? So, for example, one of the things that often comes up, and it's a really good argument that never really gets answered, is related to the second law of thermodynamics.
What follows from this point is a really long, mostly accurate, and, to an atheist who studied these things, entirely redundant explanation of what entropy is. I'm cutting out most of it here. Suffice it to say, he's definitely talking about thermodynamics, and not about something else. That may sound like an odd thing to say, but there's a reason I'm saying it.
But one thing that's the same with every single system, solar systems, coins spinning on the table, any type of system in the universe, they all die eventually, right? They all run out of energy. The sun, according to science, will eventually supernova, right?
Wrong. Our sun has about 1/10 of the mass necessary to trigger the massive gravitational collapse needed for a supernova.
And turn into a white dwarf or whatever they think is going to happen. Because they know that the going rule is that systems die over time, right?
Right. In our solar system, what will happen is, in about 7 or 8 billion years, the sun will simply run out of fuel and turn into a red giant, then a white dwarf, and finally a planetary nebula. You don't believe that's going to happen. You believe that the wrath is going to come literally any second now. But that is nonetheless what's going to happen.
That's essentially what the second law of thermodynamics says, is that over time, systems become more and more disorganized, right? And the word that they use is entropy, right? You can look that up, study it for yourself.
Like I said, this is pretty close to the truth. Here's how Oxford Languages defines entropy in the context of the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy is a thermodynamic quantity representing the unavailability of a system's thermal energy for conversion into mechanical work, often interpreted as the degree of disorder or randomness in the system.
So essentially what that means is, if the universe was started from a Big Bang, then that original state, the matter that existed at that time, had to have been more complex.
Whoa! Hang on. Complex? Where did that word come from?
Right? If you go back 1 billion years, right, and then you go forward till now, the state of matter today cannot be more complex than the original state, or it violates the second law of thermodynamics. You cannot have a system that creates more complex systems than itself. It doesn't ever happen.
More complex, you say? Okay, let's pull up that definition of entropy again. Now, you tell me, do the words complex or complexity appear anywhere in this definition? They do not. The closest we come to anything having to do with complexity is randomness, and complexity and non-random don't mean the same thing. A system can be completely non-random and completely simple. Entropy, in the sense of the laws of thermodynamics, has nothing to do with complexity. So what we have here is a bait and switch.
We have no evidence of a simple system creating a more complex system. You can't find it anywhere in the universe. It doesn't exist. There's no evidence for it.
Again, you're speaking in terms of the second law of thermodynamics, which is a statement that entropy never decreases in an isolated system. And none of the words I just mentioned reference the concept of complexity. There are many ways to define complexity, and some people have tried to invoke complexity as evidence for the existence of God, such as, the complexity of life or the complexity of atoms, but there is no thermodynamic definition of complexity.
Now, what the atheist will say that studied these things is, and if you don't understand what these terms are, that's fine, you can look them up, that the universe might just be an isolated system, right? An isolated system is a system that doesn't allow energy to leave or enter. It's isolated. It essentially is self-perpetuating, right? There is no evidence of isolated systems anywhere in the universe. We have not found one.
No one is claiming that there are isolated systems in the universe. Many people believe that the universe itself is an isolated system. Many believe it is not. Many don't have a belief either way, but nobody, not even the hypothetical atheist you just brought up, is saying that there are isolated systems in the universe. This in no way means the universe itself can't be an isolated system or an unisolated system.
Can't create them. If we could create energy forever.
What? Okay, you know what? Here's Keyla the guinea pig to explain how it works.
If we could create a thermodynamically isolated system, we couldn't create energy forever. We would simply have created a system that we can't interact with. And since we've presumably expended energy in doing so, the result is a net loss in energy, not the creation of energy. Now give me more peppers.
Right? We cannot create an isolated system. They don't exist. It's a theory that people have created in their head, right?
Dude, this whole thing is a theory you created in your head. The second law of thermodynamics literally only applies to isolated systems. So if you say the second law of thermodynamics is true, then you are conceding, you are granting, you are assuming that at least one isolated system does exist. You can't invoke thermodynamics and then say that isolated systems are a fantasy. You know, I try to apply the principle of charity whenever I can, but it's really hard to listen to you speak and believe that you have any idea what you're talking about.
So if we know that the original system that existed is eventually going to degrade into nothing, into death, essentially, like all systems do, right?
That's the second law of thermodynamics, yes, although there's no mention of death. It can be derived from the standard model of physics that all things will die because energy which can be converted into mechanical work is necessary for life to exist, and someday we won't have that energy anymore. Which means you can believe in the second law of thermodynamics or you can believe in eternal life. Not both.
Then how exactly does it go from where it was before, a more complex system?
Oh, for crying out loud. Look, you need to pick one or the other, entropy or complexity. Can't do both. And because you nonetheless insist on doing both, I can't suss out an argument here. I just can't.
How is it possible that the original, mass of matter that existed, whether it was matter at this point or not, how was that more complex than what we have today?
The original state of the universe may or may not have been more complex than it is today. It may have been amazingly complex. It may have been amazingly simple. The second law of thermodynamics, upon which you are basing this whole thing, has nothing to say about the matter either way.
And if that's the case, then that sounds like a miracle. It sounds like somebody had to create this, right? A random universe does not create complex systems.
All right. The closest I can come to steel manning this argument, and there's a good chance I'm getting it wrong because I don't think even you know what kind of argument you're trying to make. So you're welcome to respond to this and tell me that I got it wrong if that's the case. But the closest I can come to steel manning the argument is, how did we start out with zero entropy? That is, how did we start out with all the energy in the universe being available for transformation into mechanical work? And not having a lot of science education, I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect that it has to do with the puddle analogy. This is an analogy that goes back to Douglas Adams, and it has to do with a puddle which thinks to itself, look at the hole I'm sitting in right now. Isn't it amazing that this hole is exactly the same shape as I am? Someone must have specifically designed this hole for my benefit. In other words, I don't think that energy exists for the benefit of having something to fuel mechanical work. I think that mechanical work is an emergent property of the way that energy interacts with itself. Energy of this particular type exists, and as long as that's the case, the possibility of something that we call mechanical work exists. This doesn't require a miracle. Now, we are entitled to ask, why does this energy exist rather than not exist? But if the global causal system consists of God plus energy, rather than just energy, as you think it does, then we're still entitled to ask why this global system exists rather than does not exist. And since theists and naturalists can give no better answer than the other, the answer does not favor theism over naturalism. If anything, it favors naturalism, being the simpler hypothesis.
As a matter of fact, one of the things I want to close this out with is the atheist takes for granted so many things. For example, if the universe started as a random, isolated system, then there's no matter, there are no chemicals, there's no rocks, there's nothing. It's just pure energy or whatever it was.
Energy and matter are the same thing. Matter is simply energy which has been slowed way the hell down. So when you say pure energy, what are you talking about if there's no matter? Are you talking about energy which is not yet slowed down? Or are you talking about a philosophical nothing? What are you talking about?
But for that mass of matter or energy or whatever it was to come together to form the first chemical, the first compound, the first molecule, the first atom, in order for one atom to be formed in a random universe, the statistics on this are, it's astronomical, it's impossible. There is no way.
And the reason he's giving no data to back that up is that he has no data to back that up.
It doesn't matter how many billions of years you give it. A random universe without laws or rules or a governing authority.
No atheist is saying that the universe doesn't have laws or rules. They're not laws in the sense that there has to be a lawmaker, but in the sense that we observe this regularity. And this regularity makes complex systems such as stars and life possible. For f***'s sake. He's got me talking about complexity. Okay, so are we just going to pretend that the first 3 minutes of your video where you talked all about entropy didn't happen?
So according to Romans 1, it is obvious that God exists.
And that's some of the best evidence for atheism that there is. It establishes that if Christian theism were true, then the existence of God should be obvious. Not only to those who really want it to be true, or to put it more charitably, those who have a pre-existing belief and so are used to interpreting the natural world in that light, but to those who do not have a pre-existing belief. You can pretend all you want that there are no atheists in the world, but every atheist who watches this video knows for a fact, knows for a stone-cold absolute fact that there is at least one atheist in the world and that the existence of God is not obvious, and deduces from that and from passages like Romans 1 that they're right, that God does not exist.
And what people are doing is they're taking the facts, the scientific evidence that God exists, and they're saying, no, that's not scientific evidence because I don't want to believe it. It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense because it's not true. It's not what's happening. It's merely what you want to be happening, because otherwise you would actually have to confront the fact that there are reasonable atheists in the world with reasonable grounds for their atheism. And I don't believe that your belief system can survive that.
How in the world does a rock produce life? It makes no sense at all. And if it makes sense to you, I don't know what to say. The scripture says you're a fool. I don't know what to tell you.
So abiogenesis makes no sense to you personally, Jake of Tamiym Ministries, therefore God exists? That's a very novel line of reasoning. Here, let me try one. The Pythagorean theorem makes no sense to Roger over at Eastside Auto Shop, therefore mathematics is false. Yeah, no, mathematics has nothing to prove to Roger at Eastside Auto Shop. Chemists have nothing to prove to Sarah at Domino's Pizza, who doesn't understand intermolecular bonding. And biologists and atheists have nothing to prove to Jake of Tamiym Ministries, who doesn't understand abiogenesis, or thermodynamics, or complexity, or mass energy.
The argument that I hear most often from atheists is, well, religion has created all kinds of problems in the world. That is not a logical argument against Christianity. Because there's bad religions, that means that our religion is not true.
It's possible for Christianity to be a massive gargantuan force for evil and suffering in the world, and for Christian theism to still be true. It'd be surprising because we should expect that a religion superintended by an all-good, all-loving God should be an absolute net force for good in the world, but it's possible.
That, if you're a scientist, that doesn't make any sense to you at all. You would not accept that logic for any other conversation, only this one. Because atheism is your religion. That's what you choose to believe.
I'm a doxastic involuntarist. I believe that beliefs are adopted, lost, and held involuntarily. You cannot stop believing by an act of will, for instance, that London is the capital of England, nor can you start believing by an act of will that Paris is the capital of England. This is why I don't fault Christians for being Christians. I fault them for making bad arguments, as you're doing, and for taking actions in the socio-political realm which cause suffering to others based on their beliefs, but not for being Christians.
You believe it by faith, not by sight.
When you see God with your own two eyeballs, let me know. Actually, don't bother, because the plural of anecdote isn't data. Not that you've given us any data either, but if God appears on CNN, let me know.
So, listen, on the day of judgment, when you stand before God, God is not going to care about your lack of evidence, supposedly, right? You're going to say that to him, and he's going to say, nonsense. I gave you tons of evidence, right? The creation itself is evidence.
Jake, you're not a mind reader. You don't know what's in my mind. Here, I'll show you. See? If you were a mind reader, you'd have a fairly strong reaction to the thought I just had. Or at the very least, you'd turn on CNN to make sure nothing's going on. And also glance at your cat to make sure they're not trying anything funny. So your approach there, and I'm guessing you're going to turn back to Romans 1 in a second, because if I'm not mistaken, you have your Bible open to that chapter right now. The Romans 1 approach has absolutely no effect on me or any other atheist, because the one who doesn't believe me when I say I honestly see no good evidence that God exists, and lots of good evidence that God doesn't exist, is the one to whom I have absolutely nothing to prove. Conversely, the one to whom I would have something to prove if he existed is the one who will absolutely believe me. You know why? Because unlike you, he is a mind reader. Or would be if, he existed.
And again, Romans 1 makes it pretty clear that...
Hey, did I call it or what?
If any one of you can give me a good scientific argument for evolution, I would love to hear it. Explain to me.
Yeah, you know what? Not your biology teacher. But if you go down to the description of this video and click on 29 plus evidences for macroevolution, the scientific case for common descent, you'll be taken to a series of articles written by Douglas L. Theobald, PhD, who very much is a biology teacher. Now I'm going to skip a bit here where Jake talks against evolution because while theism itself cannot necessarily be reversed by learning more about the world, creationism can, and my general attitude toward the willfully ignorant is that they can while the other guy with a snow shovel.
Listen to me. It is statistically impossible.
And I'm not going to let you finish that sentence because you're claiming that something, which we know to a scientific certainty actually happened, is statistically impossible, and you don't cite even one single statistic. There are those who will let you get away with that, but if you wanted to restrict the viewership of this video to them, you shouldn't have put atheism in the title.
You should believe that Jesus Christ has died for your sins and was resurrected from the dead, and that faith in him will save you from the wrath to come.
This video in which you do in fact address atheists, this video was your chance, man. It was your opportunity to prove that what you're saying is true, that we should in fact believe these things. And what do you give us? I don't know what to tell you.
But I suppose most of you that watch this that are atheists are not going to accept that because, again, you love your sin.
If I woke up tomorrow morning believing that the Christian God exists and that I should follow him, there's very little in my life that would have to change. I wouldn't have to stop any lifestyle practices I'm doing now. Except for the whole going to church thing, I wouldn't have to adopt any new ones. I wouldn't love anyone less or more than I do now. And as for this YouTube channel, I'd actually have a field day with it because notorious atheists, and I'm kind of flattering myself here, who become theists attract lots of attention, which means lots of views and subs. Again, if you're right and I'm wrong, there's only one person to whom I would have to justify myself. And unlike you, he can read my mind. And finally, just in case there was any doubt that you have nothing to offer to convince atheists, you end with the universal argument of those who have no argument.
Jesus died for you, who was resurrected from the dead. He will be returning, and then it'll be too late. So,
I checked your website, Jake, and apparently you do believe in a literal lake of fire. And you think it's perfectly moral to threaten me with literal torture if I don't subscribe to your religion. I think if you yourself had ever been tortured, you wouldn't think that. But you do think it, so let me wrap this up by saying more or less what I say to everyone who threatens me with torture, either directly or as a proxy, and that is chicken noodle soup, the square root of Almando, and without the cardboard box. If you enjoyed this video and want to help my channel grow, please hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. Be sure to hit the bell to be notified when a new video is released. And if you have any thoughts on which room in your house is the best place to conduct your ministry, leave a comment below. Thanks as always for joining me. We'll see you in the next video. I'm David John Wellman, and the rest is up to you.